Hello, and welcome to Affording Patient Affordability Programs, the truth about voucher and bridge pricing. My name is Logan Melchioni, Senior Director of Account Management at Paysign, and I'll be serving as the moderator for today's webinar, where we will discuss the need for transparency within the patient affordability industry. We will give real-world examples of hidden costs of running voucher and bridge programs and provide you with tools and resources to evaluate and validate your current programs. Feel free to type questions within the question box at any time during the webinar. All submissions will remain anonymous, and we will not use anyone's name or company name. Following the presentation, we will conduct a Q&A session and answer as many of them as we can during the allotted time. Before we get started, Paysign is a NASDAQ-listed publicly traded company, and as such, must comply with certain disclosure laws and regulations. I do need to take a moment and read the disclosure now, so please bear with me. Certain statements contained in this webinar may be deemed to be forward-looking statements under federal security laws, and the company intends that such forward-looking statements be subject to the safe harbor created thereby. All statements other than the statements of fact included in this presentation and subsequent Q&A session are forward-looking statements. We caution that these statements are qualified by important risks, uncertainties, and other factors that could cause actual results to differ materially from those reflected by such forward-looking statements. Except to the extent required by federal security laws, the company undertakes no obligation to publicly update or revise any statements made during this webinar, whether as a result of new information, future events, or otherwise. All right, let's get into it. So today we have our presenters from the Paysign team that are seasoned experts. I have with me Matt Turner, who is the VP and Head of Patient Affordability Services.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Glad to be here. Thanks, Logan.
And I also have Cosimo Camby, who is the Director of Data Science.
Hey, good afternoon, and thanks, Logan.
Yeah, thanks for being here, everybody. So
Absolutely.
I would like to kick off this with some discussion related to why I decided to publish the article in Drug Channels, exposing the facts about bridge and voucher programs and practices. The primary discussion topic for the patient affordability vendors over the last several years that we're all familiar with has been copay accumulators and maximizers. Part of that discussion points the finger at certain players in our ecosystem for their lack of transparency and unchecked revenue. I realize that we can't talk about their lack of transparency without addressing that issue within our own channel. I believe that it's important for manufacturers and that they're aware of how funds are made by their patient affordability vendors. Many manufacturers have not seen this transparency, and we believe that this insight allows us to be the best partner for our current and our future clients.
Yeah, Logan, as a company, I think we couldn't agree more. You go back a few years, we recognize that our industry needed to be more transparent with pricing and program operations. And Mark and I were talking, and for those of you who are listening, Mark's our CEO. Mark and I had a long discussion about, the products we would offer to our clients moving forward, and, really our desire to become more transparent in how we price products. And that's a key reason, that last year we eliminated, the breakage model from our debit-based patient affordability products. And then we also offered to transition, any current programs that we had run at the time away from breakage-based products. So, at this point, we only have one breakage-bearing product left in patient affordability on the debit card side. And really everything since then has moved over to this, the preferred model that we have, which doesn't have a breakage component. And, when I think back on when I came to Paysign 3 years ago, I knew that we wanted to do things differently and really offer greater value for the services that we provide. And pricing transparency really was a vital part of that. And, I'm eager for us to discuss kind of deceptive pricing strategies that are in the marketplace that utilize spread, and really why as an industry it needs to be abandoned. We're really operating in a healthcare system that, it's riddled with hidden pockets where funds just continuously get funneled away from where they belong, which is the patient, right? We're all here for the patient. And, we want to be a trustworthy partner to our clients. And what we don't want to do is, really just add unnecessary or unjustifiable expense into the American healthcare ecosystem. We feel like that's what it means to be responsible stewards of the environment that we inhabit.
Thanks, Matt. And Kaz, as someone that deals with the data day in and day out, can you just give us a few ideas of what you're going to be covering today?
Yeah, thanks, Logan. So, the financial impacts for manufacturers are very real, right? Obviously, that's why we're all here today. But what I'm going to be covering is 4 scenarios that show how spread pricing over the course of a full year can influence really your bottom line. The examples that are covered today are scenarios that we've nicknamed the cash cow, which is a mid to large size specialty product. Then we have the small but profitable, which is an example that represents a common oncology price point with some low volume. Then we're going to go over the low cost retail isn't safe. And this will show how a 30-day free trial offer generates still substantial revenue for an affordability vendor. And lastly, we'll talk about bridge programs, which also have hidden costs associated with non-insured covered claims.
Thanks, guys. I think all of our viewers can say that they're looking forward to seeing those charts and numbers that you've prepared for us today. So first, I'd like to take a moment and just talk to our viewers about what PaySign is and what we do. So PaySign is a legacy fintech company. We are leading providers in the prepaid debit cards programs, comprehensive patient affordability offerings, digital banking services, and integrated payment processing designed for businesses, consumers, and government institutions. We are based out of Southern Nevada.
And for those, we're like right next to Vegas. So for those of you who want to, pay an in-person visit, just know we have we're 2 minutes from the Strip, 2 minutes from the airport. So lots of entertainment.
Yes, very convenient. We do specialize in the creation of highly customized, innovative payment solutions for clients across a variety of industries, including plasma, pharmaceutical, healthcare, hospitality, and retail. As stated before, we are a publicly traded company that is NASDAQ listed with the ticker symbol of PAYS, easy to remember, PAYS. To give you a brief overview of when PaySign originated, that we were founded in 2001, and in 2007, we launched our first pharmaceutical manufacturer-supported program. Since that time, we have grown significantly. A large part of our business since 2011 is providing donor compensation programs to the plasma donation centers. At this point, we have over 400 plasma donation centers utilizing our solutions. And in 2021, we processed more than $2.2 billion through our products, both plasma donation and patient affordability. So specifically regarding our patient affordability activities, PaySign has provided services within copay, bridge, and voucher programs across a wide variety of therapeutic classes in both the retail and specialty space. We focus most of our product offerings in strategic partnerships where we partner with our hub service providers, and that allows manufacturers to select the best-in-class services across all aspects of the patient support programs. So let's dive in. Matt, I do want to ask you a few questions so that everyone better understands what we're talking about today. Can you explain a little bit about the relationship that exists between the different patient affordability vendors, processors, and pharmacies?
Yeah, sure. I think there's a slide or a diagram everybody might be familiar with from the Drug Channel's website. And you can see really once you add in patient affordability programs, the vendors, and everything else, kind of the web of of financial contractual relationships, it gets really complex, right? It's already complex to begin with, and now we're adding something else in here. But what we're going to do really is just focus on how patient affordability vendors kind of operate in that web. There's really 2 models for this, right? So in the industry, there's, again, 2 ways we're doing things. The first and most common way is for a patient affordability vendor to be contracted with a pharmacy claims processor. So, these companies kind of agree to process claims on behalf of patient affordability program sponsor or the manufacturer. And the claims processor is who has that contractual relationship with the pharmacy. So that means that the vendor, right, or the patient affordability provider doesn't necessarily have control over the negotiated rates that the pharmacy are paid.
Yeah, and Matt, I want to interrupt you really quick. Can you tell everyone what you mean when you say negotiated rates?
Yes, there's another slide here we'll bring up. Okay, so pharmacies are contracted with whoever processes the claim, right, to set the rate that they'll be paid for that claim, and that includes dispensing fees, incentive fees, the rate for the drug reimbursement. It's all based on either average wholesale price, minus a percentage rate, or wholesale acquisition cost and plus or minus a percentage. So both of the claims processors that Paysign uses, the pharmacies are contracted at average wholesale price minus a percentage, and that percentage can vary between 19% and 12%. So if we were to go through and say, like, let's look at a $10,000 specialty drug, right, and then a big retailer specialty chain, so they might be contracted at A2P minus 12.5, and then they're getting a $2 dispensing fee. So that would conclude really that we're paying the pharmacy, $8,750 for the product, and then we're giving them another $2 for a dispensing fee. So we're giving them $8,752. And then if we look at like an in-office dispensing pharmacy, that contracted rate might be, A2P minus 17. And then they're only getting a 75-cent dispensing fee that we'd pay them, right? So now you're looking at $8,300 for the product and 75 cents the dispensing fee. And, as you can see, where the drug is filled really has quite a bit to do with how much voucher and bridge programs will cost you.
Thanks, Matt. And let's go back to the relationships you were talking about before.
Yeah, certainly. So, I was talking about situations where the patient affordability vendor, contracts with a claims processor. So, in that instance, the vendor doesn't really have any influence, over the contracted rates with pharmacies. And it's based on the relationship between the processor and the pharmacy, and it doesn't really include anybody else. Typically, it's influenced by, the number of patients that a pharmacy has, or what we call their reach. The larger the reach, the better the rates that they can typically negotiate for all the stores in their chain. And really, when we get into independent pharmacies, right, they will most of the time choose to utilize what's called a Pharmacy Services Administration Organization, or a PSAO for short. And these PSAOs they'll lump all of their independents into, one large chain and really attempt to negotiate with the processor for better rates. And then the next model that we see is where the patient affordability vendor is also a claims processor. And so in this case, the patient affordability vendor is the one negotiating directly with the pharmacies. And they have direct contracts with the pharmacies and pay them directly. The model's not as prevalent, and it does kind of have its drawbacks a little bit. Unless the patient affordability vendor also happens to be a pharmacy benefit manager, right, or a PBM, they're not likely to get preferred rates within the pharmacies because they don't have insured lives, living within their networks. And pharmacy contract managers, when they look at those contracts for those vendors, they look at them differently than they would with an insurance company. When I worked at the pharmacy and we're getting contracts, right, we're looking at what's the benefit to the pharmacy, not just reviewing the piece of paper on its own. So, the pharmacies are going to say we're only able to process voucher, bridge, and copay offers on those contracts, not really insured lives, which is the type of patient that the pharmacy needs the most. So it's important to remember that the manufacturer support programs are not where pharmacies are making the money to keep their lights on. It's a secondary need, and they remember that when they're negotiating those contracts back out.
Right. And what about a custom network?
Yes, so I mean, this is really the only time where a manufacturer, a patient affordability provider, a claims processor, the pharmacy, like, they've all agreed to the rate that's going to be paid. So, typically we only see those in kind of the dermatology space, but it's important to say there are some carve outs that I've seen over the years in specialty therapeutic areas where this could be done. And when I worked in the pharmacy, we would get amended contracts from time to time for a specific drug, and we could choose to execute that or decline it and not be part of that program.
And I know you did some research on the pricing industry. Can you talk briefly about what you found out?
Yeah, so when we launched Paysign's like full patient affordability offerings, right, we contracted with some industry consultants so we could properly price our products, right? And that's really when we saw how bad this specific issue was. They were giving us insights onto, what should we charge for program management? How much, could we charge for a claim processing fee? And when we started looking at the voucher and claim space, they were like, hey, well, you can, set AWP minus 8 to 9% as kind of an average number of vendors were offering for voucher and bridge programs. And since that time, we've completed some data analysis for, potential clients around this issue. And we've seen a little wider of a range, I'll say, anywhere between AWP minus 8 to AWP minus 11. And Kaz will get into that some more. I know he's got the slides that he's got pulled together here, so we can see what that looks like.
And pharmaceutical manufacturers, how are they negotiating with the patient affordability vendors?
Yeah, I think this is really the interesting part to me. Sitting in the position where I get to work with finance to set pricing and things like that. When we've been negotiating with clients around these issues, they've been really worried about that claims processing fee. They really focus on that small several dollar to dollar, claim fee, and rarely ever really address the reimbursement amounts. So it's been challenging, in RFPs in explaining that we are, in fact, substantially more affordable when you factor in all the cost associated with running a patient affordability program. And there's some other areas of hidden cost in copay vouchers and bridge. And, we can discuss those as well, but that'll be a topic for another webinar in the future.
Thanks, Matt. And let's get into some real examples. Kaz, are you ready to run us through some data and show us this example of how to spot this issue?
Yes, absolutely. So before diving in, I just want to quickly provide some background as to how we arrived at our numbers, as well as just explain how what Matt discussed earlier will apply to the information that we're about to review. So the analysis was developed by investigating the data points that we have available and extrapolating it out for our various scenarios and creating some analogs. So while the name of the pharmacy chains and networks have been anonymized, the rates and the proportion of volumes going through those pharmacies have not. So we want to remember that the core of this issue starts in the pharmacy's contracted rate with a processor. So using the example of a drug with an AWP of $10,000, this chart shows the cost of what a pharma company would be paying per claim in the displayed chains and networks. So for the purpose of this slide, we have chosen just a subset of chains and networks that we have available. So the observed rate is what the pharma company is shown through the data and from the copay vendor. And for this program, it's AWP minus 8.75. So what we're looking at now is really at a model of what is going on behind the scenes. So as you can see, the cost of the copay vendor varies quite a bit. The actual contracted rate for this example varies from an AWP of minus 12% to just over minus 18%. So these are actual contracted rates, which we derive by researching our data. And as mentioned earlier, the chains or networks with more insured lives are able to negotiate the better rates with their processors and secure high reimbursement. So that's where that difference comes in. So the copay vendors then charge the pharma company the price discussed earlier at their advertised rate, and the difference in these two is where the spread comes in. So the spread, again, is just pure profit to the vendor, and I say pure profit because spread doesn't need a call support, doesn't need a website, doesn't need a program manager. It's truly just set it and forget it. So let's look at now how these various scenarios that I mentioned at the beginning and how they impact the program's bottom line.
So I just want to add something in here really quick for the finance folks that are on the webinar, and there was quite a few of you that signed up for this. When you go back and look at that $700 number, right? When you were working with a contract with your vendor, and you were beating them up on that claims processing piece, and trying to get a nickel out of them, and you feel like they relented, they didn't care about the nickel, they cared about the $700. So that's it's a big part of this is really understanding what you're paying for in different areas. So sorry about that, Kaz. Go ahead.
No worries at all. So our first scenario, the cash cow. So this represents a high-cost, mid-sized specialty program. Therapies or drugs that might fit into this scenario could be a biologics drug that is used to treat RA. So in this example, the drug has an AWP of just over $10,000, and the program sees just over 17,000 claims per year. The claims we saw, we distributed to the various chains and networks based on just the observed distribution that we saw in our data. And as your eyes are making their way across the slide, I'm sure they jump to the highlighted spread cost. So that $14.8 million represents an additional 9% cost to the program, bringing the total for these claims up from $154 million to just under $170 million. So ultimately, that's $14.8 million that went to the patient affordability vendor as a hidden fee. So again, this is just one of our first scenarios. So let's kind of continue and see how the impact changes based on volume or price point. So our second scenario, small but profitable. So this one highlights the impact spread could have on a low volume specialty program with a high cost. So therapies or drugs that could fall into this scenario are a new to market oncology drug, which is just getting an indication in coverage. So here the AWP is much higher than our previous example. However, the volume is also much lower. Regardless, though, the program from a spread pricing still exists. In this scenario, every claim is extremely valuable, and we see the benefit cost for the year still inflated by 9%. So of what it would have been if the copay vendor was passing through the cost to the drug as they received it. All right, our next scenario, kind of moving on to the other side of the spectrum, is a low-cost retail isn't safe. And again, kind of bear with me with my nicknames here. But this scenario highlights how spread is still relevant even in a retail setting for a high volume and low-cost drug. In this program, the AWP is much lower, but the volume, again, is extremely, extremely higher. And a key factor to point out, which is something that's going on behind the scenes of the slide, is just the makeup of the pharmacies. So these are much more heavily distributed to large retail networks and grocery store chains. And you may have noticed that the range of the actual AWP shifted down by about 3% on either end of the range there. So although the spread is squeezed out by more aggressive contracts, there is still a substantial $21 million or 8% increase to the cost. So remember, this is cost added to the bottom line of what is needed to fund a year's worth of claim benefit.
Yeah, and I'm going to jump in here again and just, and I know you're going to cover bridge programs next in the next slide, but I want to kind of point out here, right? This is 500,000 claims that are on a voucher side, right? So, you're trying to get that first fill into the hands of the patient so that they can stay on therapy. And the finance folks, you're probably thinking, oh, we're paying $500 to maybe $1.5 million, for the service. In reality, it's costing you, $21-22 million of, your spend, which is a lot of money,
Yes,
right?
Absolutely. So our last scenario. So in the previous ones, we saw how drug cost, volume, and kind of especially versus retail really doesn't impact how spread could impact your price. So in this last scenario, the bridge program, this is an example how spread applies to patients with insurance as well as cash. So this scenario covers a program with a copay card offering a full or near full cost copay discount to patients that whose plans just don't cover the drug. So also known as OCC3 patients, other coverage code of 3 patients. So these programs are often used with drugs that either have poor insurance coverage, require prior authorization before the plan will provide the full benefit, or maybe just are in their launch stages and are still working out their contract or negotiating up plans. So the AWP for this program was set at about $1,500, and it sees about 100,000 claims, OCC3 claims per year. So even with that, at the end of the day, the bottom line is still very similar to what we've seen. It's an 8% increase to the benefit cost, and unfortunately, that increase equals about an extra $12 million to a benefit to a drug that is most likely not performing as well or as strong due to coverage challenges.
Yeah, and I think when I look back at like launch brands that we dealt with over the years, that's a lot of money for a launch brand to be churning out, right? Because you think these new to market oncology products, and I'm thinking of various other disease states over the course of the year, right? These can be shoestring operations sometimes, right? You got a couple of people that are really working to build the stuff for the brand. Meanwhile, you've got $12 million in a year running out the door.
Right.
Yep. So before I give the stage back to Logan and Matt, I just want to summarize kind of the impacts of what we just covered. So although the numbers we provided were analog, depending on the size of the depending on the size of the program or the drug price, we saw between 7 or 9% of the program's benefit, like you said, Matt, going to these hidden costs. So unfortunately, for me, these numbers don't need a data scientist to really explain them, and they can really kind of stand on their own, speak for themselves. And I know, as Matt mentioned, there are several of our attendees today that are in brand management, are in finance roles. I'm sure you've already started to do some quick math and kind of gauge what this impact is doing to your program.
Yeah, thanks, Kaz. And I've seen these numbers over and over, and it's still just as shocking to me to see that here today and what you provided. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and it shocks me every time too, and it makes me double check and triple check that, make sure I'm doing it right.
All right. So next, let's go into some detail about steps you can take to make sure that we can avoid these pitfalls.
Yeah. So, we've got some slides here to just kind of talk about, how we're gonna, how you should be talking to your vendor, how you should, look at contracts and things like that. So when you're negotiating your contracts, right, don't focus on the per claim fees by themselves, right? That's just part of what happens there. Again, the vendor's really happy to negotiate a rate that gets them a closing deal if they're making money somewhere else, hand over fist over the nickel that you asked for. And on the next slide here, we'll talk about kind of evaluate every listed fee for possible hidden cost, right? Compare them with a vendor who has a transparent pricing model. Don't just assume that everybody's on the up and up with this. You got to validate it. And then when you look at your contract, stipulate in those vendor contracts that the pharmacies must receive the total amount of any pass-through cost, right? And always kind of put this in in the postage realm, right? Because all of us do some kind of communication with patients, letters and things like that. I'm not going to tell you postage is pass through cost, and then you see $9 for for a stamp, right? So same thing, qualified stuff is passed through, and then this really just prevents the vendor from being able to add spread into other places like dispensing fees and things like that, or or claiming they're being charged for stuff. And then last but certainly not least, if you have the ability through your field force and stuff like that, say, hey, on Tuesday, we had a claim paid at this pharmacy. Ask that field rep to walk in and validate, if that claim shows they got $8,200, ask them to validate they got $8,200. If you see every single claim coming through at the exact same cost, that could be an indicator that you've got a spread issue. So, validate some of this stuff. And, I think obviously we're more than happy to do analysis for you. Look to see if we see spread in your programs, and then also show you, what it costs to run a voucher program through us, versus using another vendor. So, and it's as easy as shooting an email over to affordability@paysign.com, and somebody from the team will get back to you and we'll work that analysis up.
Thanks, Matt. That's really good advice. And before we do go to closing remarks and open up for Q&A, I do want to ask if you all have anything else that you'd like to share.
Yeah, so I think I'd like to close out by just kind of taking a moment to talk about really the three pillars, that we try to utilize in patient affordability. Every tool that we built, every client that we've onboarded, every interaction we have with our partners really is guided by transparency, innovation, and cost, right? We feel that these three things are synergistic to us. They allow us to create the best tools in the industry, hire the best people in the industry, maintain the highest level of client satisfaction. So, I hope that what we've talked about today, has provided, everybody that's listening with some insights into this industry and really how you can spend your patient affordability dollars, more efficiently.
Yep, and I'll just add, Logan, thanks. Again, that really the numbers we showed today obviously are analogs, numbers we derive from data we're able to see, but it's very easy for us to apply these and do an analysis directly on your programs using your data.
Thanks. All right, with that being said, that does conclude the presentation portion of today's webinar. We are going to now go into the queue of questions. Again, all questions will remain anonymous and we will not mention the name or the company associated. I will do my best to answer as many questions as possible. So if you do have questions, please drop them into the questions box. I do see that we have quite a few coming in, so thank you for sending those prematurely. Let's start with our first question. If your company can offer transparent pricing without spread, why can't others just change their models?
So I don't know why they can't change their models. I can tell you why we can do it without having to charge that. Everything we built on modern architecture. I don't need the amount of people that a lot of my competitors need to do stuff, right? So it's API-based organization. Everything runs in the cloud. We have one ecosystem that people live in. So really, we built an incredibly efficient system that doesn't require me to have a lot of redundancy in personnel. And I think that's why we can provide the services at these costs and still be comfortable doing it. I also think the fact that we're publicly traded is good for us, right? Like we ultimately want to provide a service to our clients, but we also have to translate that into value for our shareholders.
Sure.
And I think we look at things again in that synergy, right? Can we provide something at a reasonable cost, have respectable margins that make everybody happy?
Thanks, Matt. And another question, are you seeing a lot of voucher programs compared to copay programs?
And I think Kaz can weigh in on this too, right? Just because of the data side.
Mm-hmm.
We certainly see a decent amount of voucher programs. I think it just depends on the space that the drug is in. In my opinion, that has a lot to do with it, right? If you're in a highly competitive space, you're probably going to have a voucher. You're probably going to have bridge offers, right? You're going to do everything you can to kind of steal people away from your competitor. If you're in a solo world where there's nobody else, maybe you don't have anything. Kaz, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I would agree. And again, it really depends on the program. But I think we see ultimately, we see copay programs obviously much more prevalent than voucher programs, but voucher programs are out there. And unfortunately, kind of compared to copay programs, though, they're usually much more costly. The vouchers are much more costly than copay programs. So it is important to make sure that you're maximizing kind of where your spend's going.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. And when you say vendor or patient affordability programs, do you mean PBMs? If not, can you distinguish between those?
So no, we're not talking about PBMs at all.
Right.
So, a voucher runs in the primary position, right? So the voucher is saying the manufacturer is picking up 100% of the cost of the drug. Now, you can still get into spread on cash-based offers, right? If you have a cash-based offer that's pay as little as $25, you're still going to see spread there, right? Because your vendor can manipulate that data to where, the patient paid $25, but they're still messing with the data on the back end to make it look like you paid $8,000 instead of the fact that you should have only paid $7,000 or $7,250 or whatever the number is. So this is all, independent of PBMs, right? PBMs are running on their own in their primary position. They're typically associated with an insurance product, right? Which is something the patient's paid for and all of this other stuff. Yeah. So this is nothing to do with insurance and that. PBMs for us are a way for us to have a contractual relationship with the pharmacy, but it's not the PBMs that you would typically know of, right? We're not talking about like, an Express Scripts or something like that. These PBMs are claims processors, and that's a majority of what their job is.
Next question, this individual says, I've read about the issue of breakage as a hidden cost. And do you have breakage clauses in your contracts? Is this a big issue in the industry?
Yeah, so breakage has been around in the in the debit card industry for a long time, and it's common outside of, a patient affordability, obviously, right? This is Breakage is just something that happens. In the older programs that we ran, the pricing that was provided and stuff like that, allowed for breakage. And that was sometimes the people that came to you said, well, we want to be able to offer this at a really cheap price. How do we do that? And breakage is one of the ways that as a provider, you can lower the transactional fees for stuff. Now the contracts that we sign and deal with around breakage, it's not in there. So you can take the money back off the card. When the program ends, all the funds are swept back off of cards and returned back. I don't know if it's a big issue in the industry. There are certainly plenty of, fintech companies out there, debit card companies that provide services. So, but as to kind of guesstimate on the size, I couldn't say how big the issue is.
Can you avoid spread and have much lower fees by having one vendor provide cash pay or bridge options versus allowing at any retail location?
Trying to think through that. So I don't know that you can. I mean, to me, you avoid spread by just not allowing it, right? You avoid spread by having somebody that says, I'm not going to charge you spread. I don't know that necessarily splitting your business up from vendor to vendor is always a good option, right? And I'll give you an example of where I don't think it works well in that first fill, type program where the first fill's free and now we're going into copay. Well, you can't do that if you split your stuff up, right? And when you start looking at being able to track a start versus somebody continuing on in therapy, right? I think that's important. When I look at a lot of our oncology clients, right, that's an important metric for them is, hey, 500 people started this drug last month. How many of those 500 that we gave a free drug to are still on the drug for fill 2? Because if not, what'd you do the 500 vouchers for, right? So I don't know that splitting something up, necessarily helps. So yeah, I would, and I don't think the location should matter either. I mean, if your vendor's going to charge you spread, find another vendor. Like, don't be a detriment to your program just by trying to like chop stuff up to find somebody who's going to cost you the least amount of money in this one area when you can probably find somebody that'll charge you a low cost for all of it.
Do you have automatic point of sale discounts?
No. I would assume you're talking to switch-based offers in that instance, right? And I'll just refrain from mentioning their name so that I don't have lawyers calling me afterwards. No, there's, I come out of the pharmacy side. There's 2 switches. You all know the names of the 2 switches. Those are the only people that can really offer those solutions. One of those switches is owned by a much larger company. The other one, well, they're both owned by much larger companies, but those are really the only 2 places to get those automatic point of sale discounts.
And this next question, maybe you and Kaz can tag team on it. How do you perform the spread analysis for switch programs like denial conversions and e-vouchers?
Yeah, so unfortunately, because those programs happen upstream from the data that we receive, we can't go in and say this is absolutely happening. What we can do, though, is kind of similar to the way we would review your data is if we start seeing essentially your costs coming back from a specific claim at prices that don't match an AWP rate that we would expect to see for a certain pharmacy that we see for other type of claims or elsewhere in our data, then we can see there's a difference in the rate. So we could identify it the same way we would for regular copay claims.
Yeah, and I'll qualify on top of that though. The switch-based data that I've seen for these denial conversion offers is like really minimal. I've only looked at a couple pieces of it. I can't say that I've had 500 clients all share with me their switch data. But when I think about switch data stuff, it tends to be really broad, right? You're not saying pharmacy number 1 with this address and this NPI got paid this amount of money on this date, right? For this patient with this prescriber, right? Which is honestly why switch data is nowhere near as rich as copay data. So, I think there's some ways to look at that, right? Like if we look at it and say every single pharmacy is getting the exact same amount,
Yep.
that doesn't really make sense, right? Why is this big box, massive chain store over here that has thousands of pharmacies or tens of thousands of pharmacies getting the exact same amount of money that little Timmy's drugstore in the corner over here is? So I think the data analysis would look a lot different, right, than what it would be on a regular voucher or bridge program analysis.
Yeah, I would just add that the biggest difference is that what we won't be able to tell is if it's coming from the copay vendor or from the switch offer.
Okay.
We can just tell you it's happening upstream somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Okay, your transparency is innovative. What other innovative approaches to affordability solutions can you bring?
That's a long.
I'm going to give you 30 seconds
Yeah.
to answer this question.
So, I think the way we look at the ecosystem is a little differently, right? We depend on hub service providers and partners to really provide a lot of the kind of the key touch points that we do, right? We're a patient affordability solutions provider. We're not a hub services company. We don't want to be. We really like what we do. So we partner with hub service companies that are really good at doing what they do. And I think one of the biggest innovations that we provide is the ability to really integrate anybody, anywhere, anytime, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, APIs, portals, websites, and all of this stuff being already done, right? You don't come to us and say, hey, I need to integrate with you. And we say, oh gosh, well, that's a 6 months, thing for us to build this API. It's like, well, here's the API. We'll sign an MSA and an SOW. Here's credentials to turn it on. And you can start issuing cards, right? So, I think that's a big innovation thing that we have is just the speed and the ease of working with us is based around how new all of our systems are.
And to go on to top of that, I think the speed of starting a new program, whether it's a transition from an existing brand or if it's a new brand launch, right?
Yeah.
All right. The savings you discuss, while not insignificant, are not huge. Why are pharmas interested in your service?
I think not huge is is relative, right? I mean, sure, if you're like a top 3 pharma company, maybe these numbers don't like shock you. Like, oh, whatever, $7 billion or $7 million or $20 million, and like that's what we spent on travel last month. But I think for a launch brand, I think $12 million is a lot. There's some brands out there that start with, when it comes to the commercial side, they got like 3 people. And those 3 people are a big expense for them. So I think it's relative to to the size of the drug and things like that. But I also think that pharma is interested in what we're doing because we want to be transparent, right? Like I would just assume people be able to fairly negotiate with me on the pricing, and I'd be able to say no in certain instances, and they know that I'm saying no, not just because it's like like let's dance over this. It's more or less I'm having to say no because I have a margin that I have to meet because I'm a publicly traded company and I have a CFO and a CEO, and they're going to come in and say, you can't do this for 5%. You're going to mess with the numbers of the entire company. And we deal with finance people. I think they understand that.
Right.
And I don't know, I think that's one of the reasons pharma turns to us sometimes is that we come in with honesty and transparency. I sell with solutions and we sell stuff that's very tactical to a need. And I think that resonates well in the industry.
We have another good question. Do all pharmacies charge a fill fee for primary and secondary claims? I have heard that there are not fill fees on secondary claims.
Yeah. So I'm gonna be a little pedantic here over some terminology so that we stay in the same lane and we talk about stuff correctly. So a fill fee, to my knowledge, doesn't necessarily exist anywhere in pharmacy. Pharmacy calls them dispensing fees. Mm-hmm. So every pharmacy is going to get a dispensing fee on a primary claim, period. It's in every contract. It can be anywhere with 30 cents up to, a couple dollars. And then when you get into, the secondary claim, right? And by the way, when I say, primary claims, that's a bridge claim as well. A bridge claim is a primary claim because it was rejected by the primary payer. Even though you're in the secondary position, you're setting the rate. So that pharmacy's getting that, that dispensing fee based on that primary claim. Now, in the secondary claim, no, the pharmacy doesn't get a dispensing fee in a secondary claim. They can get an incentive fee. And that varies depending on the pharmacy, depending on their size, things like that. But it's certainly not, $2, $3, $4, and I mean, I've seen some people advertise that they're paying every pharmacy, $4 as a dispensing fee, which, I mean, like I say, I come out of pharmacy, Logan, you were in pharmacy.
Yeah.
I think the guy who owned the chain of pharmacies I'm at would have rolled over and died if people were giving out $4 dispensing fees on secondary claims. So yeah, I don't think I know of a single pharmacy that gets a quote unquote dispensing fee in a secondary claim because that's paid by the primary payer. The only thing you'll see is an incentive fee, and those typically tend to be less.
How big is Paysign, and is your solution labor intensive?
We're a smaller company. We're under 100 people. I don't know the exact number. I think it's, somewhere between 80 and 100, and it fluctuates a little bit. And as far as labor intensive, there's nothing labor intensive about, setting up a copay program for us, right? I mean, it's typically like 2 weeks. The transition can be a little more labor intensive, but at this point, I think we spent the last 7 months just consistently doing transition programs. Right. So I don't know there's necessarily like an intensive piece to that. It's planning it out and making sure you do it correctly.
With that was one of our last questions. We can give everyone a couple more seconds to submit any more questions that you may have before we wrap up. Do you have a fraud team, and what is their responsibility?
Yeah, so I think that's a interesting question. So we have as a debit card provider, right? We have all sorts of level of compliance and stuff that we really have to comply with. I think that exceeds what a lot of other people in the industry do. We have an entire team, and I don't want to get the number wrong, but there's a team of folks, and I think it's around 10 that are in their own like walled off part of the company, and they do nothing but look for fraud in our debit card programs, our patient affordability programs, everything else. And then, on top of that, there's a lot of, like Logan, you said, just 2.8 or 2.2 billion?
2.2, yeah.
Yeah, $2.2 billion is going through our system last year. And if those of you that are on the call don't realize, right, like we take a whole lot of risk with that $2.2 billion, because if there's a chargeback, right, that's our money we're having to deal with. So we invest a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of machine learning, artificial intelligence, all this other stuff goes into that fraud team. I can't pretend to really understand the level of stuff that they deal with because it's so far outside of the fraud stuff that I've dealt with in the past. It's very sophisticated. But yeah, we have a whole group of people that do nothing but focus on fraud.
They're great. CMS, do they have any regulation in this area?
No, they don't. We live kind of in a largely unregulated world. CMS doesn't really care what a patient affordability vendor is doing. And it's funny that somebody brings up CMS. I will say this, I think this is one of the things that's like frustrating about this for me, is I saw so many patient affordability vendors like jumping up and down, over how horrible it is that CMS was going to pass this rule, and how horrible copay accumulators are, that they're doing nothing but like, oh, here's these PBMs over here digging in the pockets of manufacturers. Meanwhile, on the backside, that's the exact same thing they were doing. They were literally, oh, no, here's a voucher. It's going to cost you, 80 cents and a $2 dispensing fee. And they just forgot to mention the $700 they were going to take out at the end of the month.
Right.
By the way, whoever asked that question, thank you.
All right. Well, I believe that will conclude our live Q&A. And again, I would like, if you would like a detailed analysis of your programs and your current programs, or have any remaining questions that were not addressed today, please feel free to email us at affordability@paysign.com. And also, please watch in your inbox for a recording of today's webinar. You will receive a copy of that. We would like to thank everyone for attending and have a great afternoon.